G'day, mate. This is Dr. Molly in Human Sexuality, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 5, Sex Hormones, Sexual Differentiation, and the Menstrual Cycle. If this seems like a lot to study in one chapter, you're right, it is. So this chapter is one of the most difficult chapters for students in the course. So take your time. You may want to get out your PowerPoint notes, the handout slides, or the outline, and take notes on that as you listen to the presentation. So we're going to start by talking about sex hormones. Hormones are powerful chemical substances that are manufactured by the endocrine gland, and they're secreted directly into the bloodstream. There are a number of different endocrine glands. Today we're going to be talking about the testes and the ovaries and the pituitary. So hormones are powerful chemical substances that are manufactured by endocrine glands, and they're secreted directly into the bloodstream. The most important sex hormones are testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So today we're going to be talking about the hypothalamus pituitary gonad feedback loop. The hypothalamus pituitary gonad feedback loop, the HPG loop. So you can see here in this slide is the hypothalamus. This is a section cut open through the middle of a person's head. You see the hypothalamus is here, and right below it is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is the master gland of the endocrine system, and it secretes hormones, FSH and LH, that act on the ovaries. And then you'll see the ovaries release estrogen and progesterone, and they send messages back to the pituitary through the bloodstream. And the hypothalamus, pituitary, and the gonads, the ovaries and testes, maintain this feedback loop. The ovaries also release estrogen and progesterone that impact the inner lining of the uterus, which is the endometrium that you learned in our last lecture. So let's start by talking about the sex hormones in males. Testosterone is a masculinizing sex hormone. It produces the masculine internal and external sex characteristics. It's a masculinizing sex hormone. Then there's follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and FSH controls sperm production in males. I like to remember FSH controls sperm production because they both are S's, FSH and S for sperm, right? So follicle stimulating hormone, it stimulates sperm production, right? Awesome. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, controls testosterone production. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus, and it regulates the pituitary's secretion of the gonad stimulating hormones, FSH and LH. So let's look at this in more detail. So you can see here, this is part of the brain, right? This is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus secretes GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and the gonadotropin releasing hormone works on cells in the pituitary to stimulate them to produce FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. And FSH and LH travel through the blood, and they act on the testes, right? The gonads, the testes in males, and FSH causes sperm production. The fancy name for sperm production is spermatogenesis, creation, right? Creation of sperm, spermatogenesis. So FSH in males cause spermatogenesis in the testes, and the luteinizing hormone causes the testes produce testosterone, right? Testosterone secretion also facilitates spermatogenesis, as well as traveling back in the bloodstream, acting to tell the pituitary, hey, we've got enough testosterone. You don't need to make any more LH. We're okay for now. And back to the hypothalamus saying, you know what? We don't need any more GnRH right now. We got enough testosterone in the blood. As testosterone levels then start to fall, then the pituitary, right, then the hypothalamus will release more gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it will release more FSH and LH, and then the testosterone will go back up. And testosterone levels stay pretty constant in the bloodstream, unlike the female sex hormones. So testosterone, like I said, acts to on the testes to create more sperm, as well as serves as a feedback loop for the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Now, the testes also secretes another hormone called inhibin, and inhibin actually inhibits the production of FSH in the pituitary. It inhibits, right? Inhibin inhibits. So which of the following hormones is most likely to be found at a fairly constant level in males? Is it A, testosterone, B, progesterone, C, estrogen, D, prolactin? In males, which of the following hormones is most likely to be found at a fairly constant level? Testosterone is the answer. Testosterone, which was A. All right, so now let's review the sex hormones in females. So estrogen brings about many of the changes of puberty. Progesterone is also important in females in the menstrual cycle. Prolactin stimulates the production of milk by the mammary glands. So it stimulates the production of breast milk. And oxytocin stimulates contractions of the uterus during childbirth. And it promotes ejection of milk from the nipples. And it promotes affection. Sometimes people call it the snuggle hormone or the cuddle hormone or the attachment hormone. So prolactin and oxytocin are also released from the pituitary. Prolactin stimulates the production of milk. So producing, just think that. Prolactin, like lactose in milk. So prolactin is like producing milk, right? So that should help you remember. Prolactin stimulates production of milk by the mammary glands. Oxytocin stimulates contractions of the uterus during childbirth. It promotes ejection of milk from the nipples, and it promotes affection. All right, how about this one? Oxytocin, A, results from secretion by the ovaries. B, curbs the contractions of the uterus during childbirth. C, suppresses milk ejection from the nipples. D, fosters bonding between parent and the newborn. Which one do we think it is? Oxytocin. It's D, fosters bonding between parent and the newborn. All right, so here's the hormonal control of estrogen. So before we looked at the hormonal control of testosterone in males, so let's look at the hormonal control of estrogen. So we'll start with the hypothalamus at the top here. It releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, and in females, this acts on the pituitary, and the pituitary releases FSH as well as LH, the same hormones, right? In females, FSH stimulates follicle development, follicle and ovum development. Follicular stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating, right? So it stimulates follicle and ovum development. It also acts to increase estrogen secretion. Luteinizing hormone released from the pituitary acts directly to increase estrogen secretion. It also helps some for follicle and ovum development. But the main job of FSH is on follicle and ovum development, and the main job of luteinizing hormone is on estrogen secretion. As estrogen is secreted by the ovaries, it also works on follicle and ovum development, and it also directly and through the ovaries, you'll also see it also works in a negative feedback loop. As estrogen levels increase in the blood, it sends a message to the pituitary, right? Pituitary measures the blood, and then it's like, oh, there's enough estrogen, so the amount of LH goes down in the blood, right? The pituitary will start to release less LH, right? As estrogen levels get high, then in the hypothalamus, it causes a decrease in the secretion of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. So there's a negative feedback loop. The hypothalamus pituitary gonad feedback loop happens in both males and females. All right, so that was a quick review of the sex hormones, okay? And we'll come back and talk about them more in the last part of this chapter when I'm talking about menstruation, but that gives you an overview of the sex hormones. So now we're going to turn to prenatal sexual differentiation. So we're going to start by talking about the sex chromosomes. The sex chromosomes transmit information to various organs in the body on how to differentiate in the course of development. The sex chromosomes in the female are XX, and the sex chromosomes in the male are XY. So mothers always give an X because they're XX to their child. Their ovum always contain an X, whereas fathers sometimes give an X and sometimes they'll give a Y. So you can see because they have an X and a Y, sometimes they'll contribute an X to the sperm and sometimes they'll contribute a Y in their sperm. So now let's talk about the prenatal development of gonads. At the 7th week after conception, after the ovum and the sperm come together, they form a zygote. 7 weeks after that moment of conception, the sex chromosomes start to direct the gonads to begin the differentiation process. For males, the undifferentiated gonad develops into a testes at about 7 weeks. For the female, the ovaries develop at around 13 to 14 weeks. If there is a sex-determining region on the Y chromosome, then the testes differentiate and male development occurs. So this is actually a really interesting process in sexual development. It's like if there is a sex-determining region on the Y chromosome, then the fetus will become a male at about 7 weeks. If there's no sex-determining region on the Y chromosome present, then about 6 to 7 weeks later, ovaries will develop. So you're either a male or you're not, basically. You either have the SRY region and you become male, or at 7 weeks, or about 6 to 7 weeks later, you'll become female. So let's talk a second about epigenetics and sexual differentiation. Epigenetics, remember, refers to a functional change to DNA that does not alter the genetic code itself, but it leads the genes to be read in a different way, so it changes gene expression. Prenatal sexual differentiation of the brain may involve epigenetic factors that can lead genes to be expressed or genes to be silenced. So it's believed that prenatal sexual differentiation of the brain involves epigenetics. All right, so what would we know about prenatal hormones and the genitals? So in females, the Mullerian ducts turn into fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the upper part of the vagina. In the male, The Wolffian ducts are supported by testosterone, and they turn into the epididymis, the vas deferens, and the ejaculatory duct. In females, the Wolffian ducts degenerate, and in males, the Müllerian ducts degenerate. Now, I like to remember this as males and wolf. Males are Wolffian. Draw your own conclusion there. Just kidding. It just helps me remember. Some of the traits of males, like being more aggressive and hunting, and early sort of traits of male genome, we just attribute things that we attribute to males. It helps me remember Wolffian male. All right, so females, the Müllerian ducts turn into fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the upper part of the vagina. And in males, the Wolffian ducts, supported by testosterone, turn into the epididymis, vas deferens, and the ejaculatory duct. So this is an image of the development of male and female external genitals. And this is at the undifferentiated stage. So before the child has developed genitals, right? This is in the undifferentiated stage. So before 7 weeks. And you'll see here the tail has been cut away. Right? So this is, if they took the tail away, this is what you would see. So you'd see this glans area, this epithelial tag. You would see a urethral fold. You would see a urethral groove. You'd see the lateral buttress in this dark blue color. You'd see the anal pit, and you'd see the anal tubercle. This part up here before the anal pit and the anal tubercle, all of these are called the genital tubercle. So in the undifferentiated state, there's the genital tubercle, right? And then there's the anal pit and anal tubercle. So one of the things that is important to note is the colors here that are used, because as we go through the next few slides, you'll see what organs come from which of these tissues. So here we go. So here is partially developed. Right, so this is development of the external genitals, and this is at partial development. So you can see here from the glands, right, what's being formed. You can see the epithelial tag, the coronal sulcus. You can see the site of the future origin of the prepuce. You can see a urethral fold forming, a urogenital groove forming, the lateral buttresses that become the corpus or the shaft, the labioscrotal swelling, urethral folds partly fused and perineal raphe, and the anal tubercle and the anus. Right? So you can see here they don't look too different yet in the partially developed stage, right? But you can start to see a little bit of difference in how they may develop. So next, let's go. All right. So here is fully developed external genitals. You can see here on the male side, we have the urethral meatus, the glans penis, we have the prepuce, the foreskin, we have the shaft or the body of the penis, the corpus, corpora. Let me look at both. Right? Then we have the pinoscrotal raphe. We have the scrotum, we have the perineal raphe, and the perianal tissues, including the external sphincter. You see over here we have the body of the clitoris, we have the prepuce, we have the glans clitoris, the urethral meatus, the inner labia, the outer labia, right, the vagina, the perineal raphe, and the perianal tissues, including the external sphincter. So you can see which of the tissues in the external genitals come from the same undifferentiated tissues, right? So you can see where the structures come from. One of the things that's important to notice, I don't know if you've ever noticed, down the midline shaft, down the midline of the penis, kind of looks like a scar. The pinoscrotal raphe, right? And between the scrotum and the anus, you'll notice the perineal or perineal raphe, right? and you can see the perineal raphe between the vagina and the anus on a female. Those come from the forming of these different tissues, right? So you can see here, this is going to become the raphe, right? So it kind of looks like a scarred area. It's just where those two tissues came. So check that out next time you are looking at external genitals. All right. There are many, many genes that are linked to sexual differentiation. This just shows you some of them, right? So each one of these are different genes. And really the only thing I want you to take away from here is that this is the ovary, a cell from the ovary, right? This is testes, right? Cells from the testes. And what I want you to notice of the ovary and the follicles is that the Mullerian ducts grow to be the female internal genitalia. And in the male, right, in the testes, the Mullerian ducts regress. And instead the Wolffian ducts, right, become the male internal genitalia. The Wolffian ducts become the male internal genitalia. So those are the things that I really want you to recognize, and they were on another slide. But you need to know that there's lots of genes linked to sexual differentiation. So when people are born intersex, there's lots of different ways that gender is determined. There's actually 9 different things that impact gender. And one of those things that impacts gender is your chromosomes. And so you can see there's a lot of different chromosomes that are linked to sexual differentiation. All right. So we've talked about the internal sexual organs. We talked about the external sexual organs. Let's talk a little bit more about the descent of the testes and ovaries during development. So we talked about the Wolffian and Mullerian ducts. The ovaries and the testes change shape and position as developmental changes take place. Okay? The testes travel from near the top of the abdominal cavity down into the scrotum via a location called the inguinal canal. So they travel all the way from the abdomen, all the way down into the scrotum via this descent process, via the inguinal canal. In about 2% of males, their testes do not descend. It's called cryptorchidism. And so they'll maybe have an empty one-sided on their scrotal sac. Maybe both sides of their scrotal sac will be empty. Cryptorchidism, an undescended testes. All right. So then how does the brain differ in differentiation? How does the brain of males and females become different? So during the prenatal period, sex hormones act on the brain. If testosterone is present during fetal development, estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus become insensitive to estrogen. If estrogen is present, they become highly sensitive to levels of estrogen in the bloodstream. So if testosterone is present during fetal development, estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus become insensitive to estrogen. But if estrogen is present, then they become highly sensitive to levels of estrogen in the bloodstream. Our brains are very plastic, and there's a constant change in our brain in response to experiences that we have. All right, so now I want to talk to you a little bit about homologous organs and analogous organs. Homologous organs are organs in the male and the female that develop from the same embryonic tissue. Analogous organs are organs in the male and female that have similar functions. So when we're talking about function, we're talking about analogous. When we're talking about that they come from the same embryonic tissue, we're talking about homologous. Now, one way to remember this is homo is same, right? So like homosexual is liking somebody of the same orientation as you are, right? Homo, one, from the same embryonic tissue, right? Analogous, analog, similar function. Both the clitoris in females and the glans penis in males play important roles in producing sexual arousal. Based on this information, we may say that the clitoris and the glans penis are A, autologous organs, B, heterologous organs, C, analogous organs, D, homologous organs. Students sometimes have problems with this question, right? Because the fact that the clitoris and the glans penis are analogous organs. However, this question is asking you about their role in producing sexual arousal, right? And their role in producing sexual arousal is talking about function. So the answer to this question is what? Analog is function, right? So it's C, analogous. They also come from the same tissue, embryonic tissue, which is why some people get confused and choose homologous. But this question is asking you particularly about function, so we know the answer is analogous. If it was asking about coming from the same tissue, then the answer would be what? Homologous. Good. So you can see here is a table of homologous organs and analogous organs. So what are some homologous organs? You can see here, all of them. You can see where they come from the embryonic source and what they develop into in the adult male and then in the adult female, right? And then you can see analogous organs in the adult male and adult female. The testes and ovaries, the glans penis and clitoris, and the prostate and Cowper's glands are analogous to the Skene's glands, the female prostate, and the Bartholin glands. All right, so I touched on just barely the fact that there were 9 variables that impact gender, right? And chromosomal gender is one of those, right? So I was talking about that there was many genes that impact sexual differentiation. There's also gonadal gender, right? Do you have ovaries or testes? There's prenatal hormone gender. So what is the prevailing hormone in your prenatal environment? Then there's prenatal and neonatal brain differentiation. So how your brain differentiates during the prenatal and neonatal times. Then there's what internal sex organs that you have, right? Then there's the external genital appearance. Do you seem to have a penis? Do you seem to have a vulva, right? Penis and scrotum or vulva. Then there's the pubertal hormone gender, right? What hormone levels are raging during puberty? And then there's your assigned gender, right? What they assigned you at birth, right? And then there's gender identity, the gender that you identify with. So you can see 7 of these are biological factors that impact gender, and 2 of these are psychological. All right, so now let's talk about atypical prenatal gender differentiation. Intersex or pseudohermaphrodite is biologically when a person's gender is ambiguous. There are many different things that can make someone intersex. I'm going to talk about 3 of them today. One of them is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, also called adrenogenital syndrome. And this occurs when normally developed ovaries begin to function abnormally later in the course of prenatal development. So, in the prenatal environment, the fetus begins to develop ovaries, and then what happens is the adrenal gland begins to grow too much, hyperplasia, grows too much, and the adrenal glands secrete androgens. And androgens are kind of similar to testosterone. Testosterone is a type of androgen. And so all of a sudden the prenatal environment has more androgens than it normally would have. And so the normally developed ovaries start to function abnormally later in the course of prenatal development. With androgen insensitivity syndrome, a genetic male produces normal levels of testosterone, but their body tissues are insensitive to testosterone. So their prenatal development becomes feminized. Right? So although they're genetically, and if you look at their cells, right, there would be XY, their prenatal development becomes feminized because their tissues are insensitive to testosterone. So these are two potential causes of the intersex condition. Another one is 5-alpha reductase that is really interesting, that these young boys are born female, and then at the age of puberty, they start developing a penis grows, and they start developing male secondary sex characteristics. And so they're born and they live the beginning of their life as female, and then at puberty, they change into male. And so 5-alpha reductase abnormality is another type of intersex condition. So far we've been talking about sexual development. So let's talk about puberty. Well, puberty is that time during which there's a sudden enlargement and maturation of the gonads, the other genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics. And really, puberty is the time that leads to us being able to reproduce, right? To have reproductive capacity. Adolescence is different. It's a psychological transition from the behavior and attitudes of the child to the behavior, attitudes, and responsibilities of an adult. Now, modern American culture has an unusually long period of adolescence compared to other cultures. And in fact, in some cultures, adolescence doesn't even occur. Blank is defined as a psychological transition from the behavior and attitudes of a child to the behavior, attitudes, and responsibilities of an adult. Yep, it's adolescence. Okay, so then what's happening in puberty for females? Well, pubertal changes include the development of breast, and that's oftentimes the first place that you see the development in a young girl, is that she will have the budding of her breasts. So there's an increase in the fatty tissue, an increase in the glandular swelling in the nipple. And so that's the first kind of start of female puberty development. Then you'll also see growth of pubic hair. And that happens after the breasts have started development. And then there's an increase in body growth. During puberty, there's also increases in fat in the hip areas and a widening of the pelvis that happens in puberty as well. Now, menarche is kind of the mark of puberty. It's the first menstruation, and it happens at about 12 to 13 years of age. In some cultures, the first menstruation is marked by celebration. So this is a figure showing adolescent growth spurt. On the bottom, they don't have the x-axis labeled, but this is years of age. And this is height gain in centimeters per year. What do you notice about this graph? Okay. You'll notice that the peak in height gain happens earlier for girls than it does for boys. But you'll notice that boys have a higher peak, right? And so you'll notice that girls peak about 2 years earlier than boys. Girls usually peak right here, and boys usually peak around here. So about 13 for girls and about 15 on average for boys. So what are the pubertal changes that happen in the male? Well, in the male, they experience a growth of the testes and the scrotal sac, the growth of pubic hair. Their penis begins to enlarge. About 2 years after pubic hair starts to develop, there's a growth of facial and axillary hair, right? Axillary hair is armpit hair. Then their erections tend to increase in frequency, right? They begin to have nocturnal dreams, wet dreams. Their voice drops or starts to change. Has anybody ever known people who were young males who were singers in boys' choirs? In boys' choirs, they have beautiful voices. They oftentimes sing just so beautifully, but they can sing very high notes. And as puberty ensues and the voice stops to drop, many young boys, after spending lots of years in boys' choir, have to retire from boys' choir because their voice changes and they can no longer sing the notes that they were originally required to sing. And then also pubertal changes in the male include increased body growth. So in puberty, it turns out boys are more likely to experience acne than girls, but lots of times during puberty, the hormonal changes and surges do cause acne spells. So biology of the menstrual cycle. So we've talked about now, we start out in sex hormones, then we talked about prenatal sexual development and then pubertal sexual development, and now we're going to talk about the biology of the menstrual cycle. So everyone listen up. I know lots of times it's tempting to think, well, I don't have a period, so I don't have to worry about a period, right? That's not true. Everybody should understand how menstruation works and the menstrual cycle works. So the menstrual cycle is regulated by fluctuating levels of sex hormones. These hormones produce changes in the ovaries as well as the uterus. Humans, interestingly, are nearly unique among species in having a menstrual cycle. Other species of mammals have estrous cycles. Well, what are estrous cycles? Well, have you guys ever heard of how dogs go in heat? Right? Yeah. Heat is an estrous cycle, right? It's the time when most female dogs engage in sexual activity. They don't really engage in sexual activity outside of their heat spells, and so it's interesting. Females engage in sex, right? Female humans engage in sex whenever they would like to, not just when they are having an estrous cycle, because women have a menstrual cycle, and so it's different. All right, so there are 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. So you want to learn these before we move to the next slide set. So you want to spend a few seconds really studying these. So there's 4 phases. There's the follicular phase that we also call the proliferative phase. There's the ovulation stage. Then there's the luteal phase, which we also call the secretory phase. And then there's menstruation. When I was first learning the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle, I was trying to remember that the follicular phase and the proliferative phase are happening at the same time. So I started to think about the fact that pH sometimes sounds like F. And so I was like, oh, okay, so the F word and the P word go together. I don't know if that will help you, but that's something that helped me. Proliferative phase. Okay, so there's 4 phases. The bold phases, right, are ovarian, and the unbold phases are uterine. So we'll see this in a second. So this is a great graph showing you the biological events of the menstrual cycle, levels of hormones produced by the pituitary. So these are the pituitary hormones. What are the pituitary hormones that are involved in the menstrual cycle? LH and FSH. What are 2 other pituitary hormones that we talked about prolactin and oxytocin, but they have nothing to do with the menstrual cycle. Okay, so the menstrual cycle, the pituitary hormones that have to do with the menstrual cycle are LH and FSH. On the y-axis, you'll see on the left side plasma concentrations of pituitary hormones in arbitrary units. So you'll notice here that there's an spike in LH and FSH before this dotted line. And the dotted line is a symbol of ovulation. So right before ovulation, there's a spike in LH and in FSH. And this is the level of hormones produced by the ovaries, right? And the ovaries produce which hormones? Yeah, estrogen and progesterone. Good job. So these are the levels of the ovarian hormones. You'll see this is a plasma concentration of ovarian hormones in arbitrary units. And what do you notice about them? Yeah, you'll see estrogen goes up quickly right before ovulation, right? Then estrogen starts to go down and progesterone starts to go up, right? And then estrogen starts to go up again here. Right, so there's a second hump in estrogen, and then they both precipitously drop off, and this is when menstruation happens. Okay, so this is ovulation. This is menstruation. So right before ovulation, estrogen peaks. Right after ovulation, progesterone begins to be produced. Then they both fall precipitously right before menstruation. All right. This is a fabulous kind of picture, not graph, figure to study. So this shows us changes in the follicles in the ovary and changes in the endometrium in the uterus. So I kind of wish this was organized differently, but it has great information on it. Okay, so you can see here, these are all ovarian follicles changing across time. This is the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, and its changes across time. And you can see the time is here in this rows of days. Then over here are the labels for these different time periods. What's going on in the uterus, the uterine phases, and then the ovarian phases. Okay, so the uterine phases, right? Menstrual flow. Then after menstrual flow, you can see that the uterus starts to proliferate. It gets thick. The cells start to divide. It becomes better distributed blood vessels. It starts to get really healthy and thick. This is the proliferative phase. Why is it getting all this increase in thickness and health and cells and blood vessels? Why is it doing that? Why is it proliferating? Well, it's proliferating so it can be ready for an egg should it be fertilized, right? So this is an egg right here. Right? In the uterus, after the egg has been secreted, after it's been kicked out of its follicle, then this part of the uterus starts to then secrete nutrients to prepare for a fertilized egg. So this part of the uterine phase is called the secretory phase. Okay, so then after the secretory phase, about 10 to 12 days after ovulation, which is marked right here, about day 14, when the egg is expelled from the follicle, this is ovulation, about day 14, then all this uterine lining becomes really nice. It starts to secrete all these nutrients to prepare for a fertilized egg. About 10 to 12 days after day 14, if no fertilized egg gets implanted, then the uterine lining begins the process of getting ready to die off, right? So you can see here, then there's the sloughing of the endometrium that consists of cells of the endometrium, cervical and vaginal secretions, and blood, right? It gets sloughed off during menstruation, during menstrual flow. So you can see that this part of the figure here repeats over here, right? So this part right here, day 1, starts right after day 28. So you see, day 1 would be just right here after day 28. And you can tell it looks exactly the same as over here. I wish they had put a 1 right here, right next to day 28, so that you could see, oh, okay, after day 28, then starts day 1, and this process starts all over again. Okay, so that was what was happening in the uterus. Now, what was happening in the ovaries? Well, I wish that they had put this up here so you could see a little better. But anyway, this is the ovarian phases. So here's a follicle, right? And over the course of the days, the follicle starts to mature and help the egg in its development, right? So the follicle is maturing, it's getting better, and it's helping the egg develop. At day 14, the egg gets expelled. So we go from the follicular phase, where the follicle is developing, to ovulation. And then after the egg, the ovum, is released from the follicle, the leftover follicle becomes what we call the corpus luteum. Okay? The corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum then is what's responsible for progesterone secretion. What? Okay, this is starting to make sense, I'm thinking. Hopefully it is. So this is the luteal phase, right, in the ovaries. The luteal phase. All right. So should we go through this one more time? I think it might help. Okay, so this time I'm going to go through, well, let's do it in the same order. So here we have in the uterus, right? On day 1, we start bleeding, right? So there's menstrual flow, and we usually bleed for about 4 to 5 days, right? At around 5 days, then, in the uterus, the uterine lining starts to proliferate, the proliferative phase, where it's getting thick, blood vessels are being formed, the cells are dividing to help start preparing to get thick, so that there could be the mother's contribution to the placenta should a fertilized egg end up attaching, right? So this endometrium is proliferating. At day 14, when the ovulation occurs, then the endometrium starts to secrete these nurturing, nourishing substances. The glands start to secrete these substances that would help to help the fertilized egg to be nourished, right? So they release all these they secrete all these nourishing substances. So this portion is called the secretory phase in the uterus up to day 28. From ovulation to day 28 is the secretory phase. Okay, so that's what's going on in the uterus. There's menstrual flow followed by the proliferative phase, then there's ovulation, and then the secretory phase happens, right? In the ovarian phases, we have a follicle at the beginning, right? And the follicle starts to develop and help the ova inside develop. And so we have the follicular stage all the way till the ova is ready to be released, and then it gets released at ovulation, right? So it goes, ovarian phases are follicular, then there's ovulation, and then after the ovum has been released from the follicle then becomes the corpus luteum, and then the corpus luteum starts to mature and produce progesterone, and that stage is called the luteal stage, and it's the stage after ovulation, day 14 to day 28. All right, hopefully y'all have learned that, me going through it twice. Now you can go back here and see, right before ovulation, the estrogen peaked, right? And then what happened at ovulation? I told you the corpus luteum starts to develop, right? The corpus luteum starts to produce this progesterone. Pretty cool. until it starts to degenerate, right? And then you'll see the progesterone levels dropping back down. Okay. So now we're going to go through it side by side. So what happens in the ovaries during the menstrual cycle? So now we're talking back to ovaries, right? And so think about the stages, what's going on in the ovaries, right? So there was the follicular phase, there was ovulation, and then the luteal phase. Those were the three, right? There was follicular stage, ovulation, luteal phase. So in the follicular phase, what's happening? Well, high levels of FSH are secreted. High levels of follicle-stimulating hormone are secreted by the pituitary, right? And this FSH causes the follicles to develop. So the function is to stimulate follicles in the ovaries. One follicle begins to ripen and bring an egg to maturity. What happens if more than one follicle comes and ripens? You could end up with 2 ovum, right? Oh, and end up with dizygotic twins, right? Fraternal twins. So if more than one follicle ripened, which is unusual, you could end up with dizygotic twins. Okay. So in a normal menstrual cycle, though, just one follicle begins to ripen and it brings an egg to maturity. That follicle secretes estrogen, right? So you can go back here and you can see, right, the follicle, as it becomes increasing in maturity, is secreting estrogen, right? Pretty cool. At ovulation, that follicle ruptures open and it releases the ripened egg. Remember, at ovulation, the follicle ruptures and it releases that egg. During the luteal phase, after releasing an egg, the follicle turns into the corpus luteum and it manufactures progesterone. Remember I told you, after ovulation is the luteal phase. This is the corpus luteum, right? And it's starting to secrete progesterone. And then it starts to degenerate and progesterone levels fall. In menstruation, there's the shedding of the inner lining of the uterus, right? Which is really a part of what's happening in the uterus during the menstrual cycle. So what's happening in the uterus during the menstrual cycle? Okay, so these slides are going to be what's happening in the uterus. So you remember in the uterus, right? What's happening? So during the follicular phase, high levels of estrogen stimulate the endometrium. And so in the uterus, what's happening is proliferation. During the follicular stage in the ovaries, the uterus is starting to proliferate, right, to get ready. So high levels of estrogen stimulate the endometrium. During the luteal phase, progesterone secreted by the corpus luteum stimulates the glands of the endometrium to start secreting those nourishing substances. So during the luteal phase, right, the corpus luteum stimulates the endometrium to start secreting all these nutrients. And so this part is called the secretory phase in the uterus. So on these slides, I would put by follicular phase, I would put proliferative phase. And by luteal phase, I would put what? Secretory phase. Good. All right. So what happens in the uterus during the menstrual cycle? Well, the corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone for about 10 to 12 days. If pregnancy has not occurred, hormone output declines, right? So if the egg does not become fertilized, right, and it doesn't then embed itself into the uterus, then hormone output starts to decline after the corpus luteum has been around for about 10 to 12 days, right? So you can see here, there starts to be the decline in the releasing of hormones. Menstrual fluid, right? During menstruation, what are the components of the menstrual fluid? Well, there's blood from the endometrium. All that blood that had gone into the endometrium is sloughed off. Degenerated endometrial cells get sloughed off, as does the mucus from the cervix and the vagina. A normal menstrual cycle is about from 20 to 36 days. The average is about 28 days. Now, it's really important for you to think about your own menstrual cycle. For those of you who have one, right? How long is your average cycle, right? They should be on average about 28 days. They should range between 20 to 36 days. If you're having cycles over 36 days, you could end up having anemia, right? Because with each menstrual cycle, you're sloughing off blood, right? And so if you are having, shorter menstrual cycles, right, and you're bleeding more frequently than every 28 days, then you need to probably go see a physician about that, unless you've already done that, right? So if you are cycling more frequently than every 20 days, then you can end up being anemic. So really important to know. An average cycle, menstruation begins on day 1 and it continues until about day 4 or 5, right? So on average, people bleed for about 4 or 5 days, right? If you're bleeding for more than a week, that's another thing that you should talk to your doctor about, right? Because eventually, if you're bleeding 2 weeks out of the month, for instance, right, you're going to lose too much blood and you can end up becoming anemic. So menstruation begins on day 1 and it continues till about day 4 or 5. The follicular phase is from about days 15 to day 13. Ovulation occurs on day 14. And then the luteal phase goes from about day 15 to the end of the cycle, day 28. I don't really love this figure here because I wish that they had started the follicular stage on the ovarian thing about right here, right? Because the follicle, right, really starts getting good development a little bit later in the cycle, as it's stated here, about days 5 to 13. If a woman has a regular 28-day menstrual cycle, the day of ovulation is assumed to be what day? 14, that's correct. So what else do you want to know about ovulation and some other cyclic changes that happen during menstruation? Well, for some women, they report that they can feel themselves ovulate. And it's this really quick cramping in their lower abdomen. The name of that is called Mittelschmerz or middle pain. And so some women can feel when they ovulate. Sometimes women will have a menstruation that takes place without ovulation, an ovulatory cycle, and without ovulation, an ovulatory cycle. So people can menstruate without ovulating. There's 2 other physiological processes that fluctuate with the menstrual cycle that doctors may tell you to check out if you're trying to get pregnant. One of those is the cervical mucus cycle. Cervical mucus thins and becomes more alkaline right before ovulation. And so people will talk about their vaginal secretions, their cervical mucus, and what it looks like. There's a fanning of cervical mucus if you put it on a slide. Has anybody ever tried to breed dogs? Because they will they'll do a slide smear of the secretions to see if the dog is getting close to being fertile. And so it's an interesting use of that. The basal body temperature cycle also changes. And so if you're trying to get pregnant, sometimes they'll tell you to take your temperature. And so that's another thing that can be really helpful. All right. So how do hormone levels change over the menstrual cycle? So you'll see here, this is in women who aren't taking the pill, right? This is just women naturally. We have an increase in estrogen, right before ovulation, caused by the follicle, right? And then at ovulation, the corpus luteum starts to produce progesterone, right? And as it also starts to produce estrogen, right? So those levels start to go up again, right? And then there's a precipitous decline as the corpus luteum starts to deteriorate, right? So this is the cycle in non-pilled women, right? There's a one hump right, for the progesterone, and there's 2 humps for the estrogen. Okay, so estrogen's in black and progesterone is in green. I should have started there. In group 2, for people who decide to take a combination birth control pill, right, how does it work? Well, there's placebo, there's nothing in the first 4 days, no estrogen and no progesterone, right? And in a combination pill, you take high levels of estrogen and progesterone all the way through until right before the very end of your cycle when you stop. And this quick stop in the estrogen and progesterone causes the bleeding, right? And then you bleed through this period. And then you do the combination pill again, and the same thing happens. Now, that's one way that pills are manufactured. Another way is a sequential pill, right? Where on day 4, the estrogen levels, go up, right? And they stay up, right? And progesterone levels just start going up late in the cycle, right? So they only add progesterone later on in the cycle. And when they both have the precipitous drop, the person menstruates, and then the active ingredients of the pill start again, sequentially estrogen, until about day 21 when they add the progesterone. Then they both stop, and then the person bleeds, right? So those are some different types of birth control pills. So what are some menstrual problems that come up? Well, dysmenorrhea, painful menstruation, can be really difficult for young women. The possible cause, as far as we know through research, is prostaglandins in the uterus that cause uterine contractions. For some people, menstruation is really painful. They may even have bouts of diarrhea, headaches, feel very lethargic. And so for some people, it's very uncomfortable. Those prostaglandins cause a lot of uterine contractions. Endometriosis is also a painful condition. It's when the endometrium, which is the inside lining of the uterus, the tissue grows in a place other than the uterus. So it can grow in other places in the abdominal cavity. And this endometrium responds to the changes in hormone levels. And so it also causes it proliferates and causes blood loss during the menstrual cycle, and this can cause a lot of pain in other places in your abdomen. So endometriosis is a really painful product. So if people have painful menstruation, it's important for them to be checked to make sure they don't have endometriosis, right? That's important. Amenorrhea is the absence of menstruation. Amenorrhea, amenorrhea. Primary amenorrhea is when the female has not had a menstrual cycle by about the age of 18, right? We call that primary amenorrhea. Secondary amenorrhea is the absence of menstruation if she's already had at least one period in her life, right? So she had a normal period, and then those normal periods stopped, right? And so that's secondary amenorrhea. So what's the most common cause of secondary amenorrhea? Pregnancy, right? Pregnancy is the most common cause of secondary amenorrhea, because when you get pregnant, right, you don't slough off the inside lining of the uterus. The endometrium, right, becomes the maternal contribution of the placenta. So the most common cause of secondary amenorrhea is pregnancy, but there's also other causes. Cysts, diet. If people's body fat drops below a certain percentage, then their body no longer expends the energy to have a menstrual cycle. So sometimes women who are anorexic, have other eating disorders with a low body weight, then they stop having a period and they become infertile. So that's another potential cause of secondary amenorrhea. So fluctuations in mood for women. So some women experience premenstrual syndrome, which is a combination of severe physical and psychological symptoms. Women experience things like depression, irritability, and it occurs just before menstruation. Oftentimes they often have bloating as well, a little bit of weight gain. And the American Psychiatric Association formalized PMS in the DSM-4-TR with the diagnosis of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD, right? So for some women, this is difficult time for them, and right before menstruation. Now, research on intellectual and athletic performance during the menstrual cycle indicates that A, peak performance occurs around ovulation, B, diminished performance occurs just prior to menstruation, C, diminished performance occurs during menstruation, or D, no meaningful fluctuation exists over the cycle. I didn't talk about this, but I want you to know this. So it turns out, right, that even though some people experience premenstrual syndrome and there's fluctuating hormones and we're bleeding for some part of the month, research on intellectual as well as athletic performance and job-related performance during the menstrual cycle indicate that really over the course of the cycle, there's no meaningful fluctuation in performance or in intellectual functioning. So don't believe when people tell you that you're not functioning normally. Because on average, right, there's no meaningful fluctuation over the cycle. All right. So how about fluctuations in sex drive for women, right? Well, studies about fluctuations in sex drive for women over the course of the menstrual cycle have contradictory results. Some have found a peak frequency of intercourse around ovulation. Others have found peaks just before and just after menstruation. One study indicated that sexual activity initiated by the woman peaked during the first 3 days before and the 3 days after ovulation. One really interesting study analyzed daily fantasy diaries and urine tests to determine the days of ovulation for women. It's interesting that both frequency of sexual fantasies and the arousability of those sexual fantasies were highest at ovulation. So women were more likely to experience more sexual fantasies and those sexual fantasies be more arousing at ovulation. There's also an increase in the number of males reported in the fantasies at ovulation, and this indicates that the maximum sexual arousal occurs at the time of a woman's peak fertility. What's also interesting is testosterone levels also peaked at ovulation. So that's a really interesting study to help us understand a little bit about the sex drive for women. So then sometimes people ask me, well, Dr. Molly, do men have cycles as well? Well, the traditional assumption was that men do not experience monthly cycles, but one study said that men testosterone levels displayed weekly fluctuations. Men who had a female partner who wished to have a child, they were trying to get pregnant, displayed a 28-day cycle of testosterone levels. Really interesting, right? So the male began to fluctuate his levels of testosterone levels with his partner who was trying to get pregnant. Men who had sex with an unfamiliar partner, someone they didn't know, hadn't had sex with, showed a 100% increase in testosterone levels the following morning. Wow, that is a huge increase. What does that mean? I hope you have been able to follow along well with this lecture. I know chapter 5 is a lot, right? We went through sex hormones, then we went through sexual differentiation, and then we went through menstruation. This is likely going to be a chapter that you'd like to listen to twice. There's some discussion board posts. Feel free to ask me any questions you have about this chapter in the discussion board on the chapter content questions. I'd love to help you out and help you understand this process. And I will look forward to sharing with you the next chapter. Bye-bye.